Hello, welcome to the Believe Show. We're delighted to welcome you today, especially since we have with us today LeeAnn Mallorie. And let me tell you a couple of things about LeeAnn before we start asking about her beliefs. LeeAnn Mallorie runs Guts and Grace Women's Leadership, and she is the author of The Guts and Grace of A Woman's Guide to Full-Bodied Leadership. We've had LeeAnn on this program before. You've probably been with us when she was on, and we're delighted to have her on with us today. Hello, LeeAnn.
Hi, Sonia. It's so great to be here again. Thanks for having me back.
It's so delightful to have you here. I want to talk about you and your book and your work. So let me start with, if we're thinking about the field of women's leadership, what is it that you believe to be true that others may disagree with you on in this field?
Well, the truth is there may be a couple of things, Sonia, but you know my work some, and you know that I'm an embodied leadership coach and trainer. So one of the first things I would say about that is that I deeply, deeply believe that the body and the information that we get from our bodies actually is the doorway, in particular, the doorway to more senior levels of leadership. And folks may go, like, what do you mean by that? And what I really mean is that often if we're kind of focused on trying to get ahead in our work and in our lives, we'll do things unconsciously that end up overriding some of what our body might be telling us. And that is, I would say that's been maybe like a survival strategy that we've unconsciously developed over time, because if we've grown up or we've built our careers in workplaces that were not built by people who look like us, so let's say we're a woman in a male-dominated industry, for example, we've kind of learned the rules of the road and kind of figured out, well, here's how I can make that work for me. Often at some point, though, you start to see the body starts to break down, people experience burnout, or just in some way it's like, oh, I have a longing for something else that doesn't seem like what I'm supposed to do to get to the next level right now, or a longing for a career pivot or something that might be a little different than what the track that I've been on that seems like the obvious path to promotion. At that moment, what typically happens is that folks will either go, I should ignore that, keep my head down and keep going because I want to get the next rung on the ladder, or they start to pay attention and listen. Sometimes it happens that we can't not listen, like we go through some kind of a breakdown or stuff, or like we get pulled out by our bodies sometimes. But if we don't, it's like we have this choice point. And I deeply, deeply believe that even though sometimes the process gets messy in the middle there, that if we listen to that, it will take us where we're supposed to go. And it's not going to take us out. It's going to take us to the next level of impact or the next place that we have the possibility to contribute in an even bigger way. It's just that it's kind of a leap of faith because that's not what we're trained to do, especially in the workplace.
So is it accurate to say that in the field of women's leadership, many people, I've been to many women's leadership conferences that are wonderful, they say really aim high, go for it, take your action, find your right path, and you agree with all that. But it sounds like the additional thing that you're adding is listen to yourself and listen to your body, and you may need to tweak your path.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I wouldn't say I'm the only person who's singing this song, but I think it is, it's a little different than just lean in. It's like lean in and, or lean in except when something else is happening that you need to listen to. And I think the problem starts to happen when we find ourselves in this massive trade-off. I see and feel that I want this next level, but I can tell that if I'm doing things the way that I've been doing them, it's going to mean that I have no time for my family anymore. It's going to mean that my health is on the line. It's going to mean something else that I don't want. And so I think if taken too far, the predominant kind of song that gets sung in the women's leadership realm, it's like it kind of assumes that you're already running the story and running the pathways and running the paradigms of being in yourself that are right for you. And then if you just keep doing that, everything will be great. But if you're not, which I think many of us aren't, because we get again into the workplace and we go, let me base what works for me on what I see other people doing that may not be like me, then we're actually starting to pull ourselves further away from ourselves. And so ultimately the practice is to be able to track for that trade-off and trust that choosing you, this is why I use the expression full-bodied leadership, like that, that if there is a choice point where the trade-off is too big, that finding a way to dissolve that trade-off or not override there will actually be the pathway to more. And I think in some ways it can feel like, oh, that's the pathway to less, or it's like either I can have this or I can stay home and have my life or have my kids or feel better. And it's actually like that moment, which is something, happens more than once sometimes in a career. I won't say it's just a one-time thing, but often there'll be a moment. And for some of us, it'll be at like 25, and for some of us, it'll be like 55. But there's this moment where we go, oh, I'm if I wasn't willing to have that trade-off anymore, then we have to get creative. Then we have to listen differently. Then we actually have to learn a new way of being in ourselves and doing. And it's that new way, it's that process that actually births the next part of ourselves. And I don't think they teach us that in business school.
No, no. And why is this particularly important for women's leadership as opposed to leadership for men, for women?
In some ways, I say it's relevant for everyone.
Yeah, what you're describing sounds universal about you may be on a path, but you may not be aligned. Check in regularly.
Totally. And there's been such systematic programming out of the feminine in the business context that I think it's more likely, or there are more maybe commonalities or typical trends that women as a collective are facing of ways that we're invited, encouraged, maybe required not to be ourselves. So anybody goes into the workplace, especially if it's a workplace that doesn't fully align with your values, or there's something that isn't quite jiving about the culture with you, for example, you're going to have that same kind of moment. And certainly, me, I also build programs for teams and I coach men leaders and women leaders. But the Guts and Grace method was really born to start to go, what are the systematic ways that in general, the feminine, if we say it that way, is more like an energy or an aspect of ourselves that women, for example, may want to embody more, hasn't been programmed into what we do in our workplaces. Now that is changing. So I also believe that at this time, whether you're a man or a woman, tracking those ways that we've culled the feminine or aspects of ourselves out of what's okay in the workplace or what's invited in a business context, bringing that back in at this time is important. Makes a difference. You see, for example, right now, and it's not necessarily women doing it, right? But for example, you see that women heads of states have been performing better during the COVID pandemic. We go, well, why is that? Well, certain things like listening or more inclusivity or empathy, the different ways of paying attention that maybe are more naturally a part of the feminine being chosen into, which isn't necessarily what they were taught in growing up or in working in their fields, but making those choices that are a bit countercultural make a difference. So I think I lost your question, but I hope that gets a little bit at where we were going.
No. That's very helpful. That was a very clear trajectory for me. Why Guts and Grace? What do each of those two words mean?
Totally. In some ways, although it's not at all this cut and dry, Guts and Grace really is that looking that goes the masculine and the feminine. And can I be not in a stereotypical way or not in a, what it should be kind of way, but in an actual way that's the right balance for my own leadership? Can I be both? Can I embrace all aspects of myself? So what I tend to see, for example, is that most folks, women in particular, and most folks, but I see this a lot in women that I coach, have favored guts. We love this word grit, right? We're positive psychology. Like we love the word grit. We know that grit gets you ahead. We know that something about, buckling down, driving, right? We can use this word. Will get us ahead. Will get us somewhere. Will make something happen. And it's not the only ingredient needed in great leadership. And so the title Guts and Grace, which wasn't the original title of the book, actually, I'll tell you more about where it came from in a minute. But ultimately, this expression is like when people hear it, they go, oh, yeah, I want both. I need both. And most folks maybe have majored in one or the other. So often folks who've majored in grace, maybe they're not hanging out in the corporate sector. They might be doing something else with their lives. Folks who have majored in guts, or it's like, that's what I know I want to bring, or I feel comfortable doing that, or that's kind of my sweet spot, are often getting ahead at work. And then at some point, again, there's that moment where there's a reckoning. It's like, oh, I may need to rebalance here. So when I work with folks, often the setup is, can you learn, and this is also positive psychology, right? For practical wisdom, can you have access to both guts and grace, let's say both sides of yourself or parts of yourself, and whatever you put in those buckets, right? You could define it. But can you then, in any given moment, depending upon what's actually needed by the situation, bring the right one? And to do that, you have to be able to read the situation and go, okay, this is a moment where Gus is going to be needed. This is a moment where grace is going to be needed. You also have to be able to do both of those things. So if you have lived a life where you've over practiced guts, then at that moment, you might not have a strong enough grace muscle to be able to bring the grace that's needed, or you just might see guts as needed because that's what you're used to seeing. So I'm working with folks to be able to go, oh, I've embodied both, full-bodied leadership. I've embodied both. And I can tell when I'm maybe being driven by habit or being driven by what's actually needed in the moment. And just that alone, now I say that like it's a small thing, but just that alone makes her a great leader, because you're actually responding to what's needed in the moment in a much more flexible, fluid way. For example, I would say that's part of what's happening when you see the countries that have been successful during this time.
Can you give us an example of somebody who, it could be a leader that you've worked with, it could be a colleague who applied your guts and grace framework, but how is it that you took someone from not being aware and focusing on these things to this, and what actions did they end up taking?
Totally. I mean, I was thinking this morning actually about whose stories might be good for this conversation. And I actually just started working with a woman who works at a pretty well-known tech company. I won't say the name, but she works in Australia. And so she came to me and she was like, look, I aspire to senior leadership. I'm super burned out. I know that what I do is that I move fast, I drive hard, I get things done. And what I see is that that's what people are asking of me. It's like I can be relied on to do that. So then I end up getting, people send stuff to me because no one else is going to be able to do it as quickly or as well or as fast. And she was like, look, I love the idea of guts and grace. I don't know, but I feel like I just over rely on this sort of gutsy part of myself. And I started talking to her, and what I found out was that she was actually also, so she was high performing in a tech company, also a certified yoga instructor. And I was like, are you practicing yoga? I mean, it was like the last thing on the intake form or something. And she's like, no. And so we started talking about, what yoga meant to her and what that aspect of her was like. And what we landed on, which was so beautiful, was this concept of how did we express it? Elegance. So not elegance like, wearing a beautiful dress, but elegance like minimum effort, maximum result. And this idea of can I be in my work life in a way that is elegant, like the practice of yoga, or like this concept that I learned in my yoga teacher training. And so she was able to start playing with that in her leadership. At the same time, we also were working on, can you listen to your body more deeply? And what's this sense of burnout, or what is this something not working, not feeling good telling you? And what she found was this longing, really like just by feeling herself, it was like, I'm just longing to be held. And held was both, kind of a very physiological sensation, but also what came up for her there was community. Like, I want to be held by community. So it kind of started like, well, should I just quit my job and go be a mom and find a community? Her husband had community in New Zealand, actually. And so they were like, well, maybe we should just move back to New Zealand. And I was like, well, that's cool. What would that look like for your career? And what that opened was a whole vision around senior level leadership in a new geography where there was not much going on. So now she's got a 5-year plan for her career that came from what felt like burnout and a sense of longing. And she's also got a sense of, I can practice at work differently in a way that honors both guts and grace. And what that led to was within 3 months getting a next level promotion that we didn't even know was available when we started working together.
That's at the same company. That's before they physically moved from Australia to New Zealand. That's at the same place.
Yeah, that's the move. The move is the 5-year vision, but the seeing that big, right? It's like she wasn't even willing to consider because that's like a 3-level promotion for her. But it was like, oh, we could see that that would meet the longing. And so it wasn't like looking up and going, I don't want the job that the people 3 levels up from me have. It was like, oh, I can look up and I can envision that from this place where I'm connected to myself, that job would actually be the right fit for me in a couple of years. And then backtracking and going, well, what's the next possible thing here? And taking that step. And taking that step in a way where it was both, I'm going to reach and I'm going to bring myself to it, but I'm going to do it in a way that's aligned with me. And I'm going to be out about where I'm heading that would have been a really big stretch. So I guess I share that as a possible example of both working with guts and grace, both being in practice and also listening differently, but also that sometimes we think like there won't be a pathway. And when we start tuning in this way and playing differently, a pathway we didn't think was there starts to open up, and sometimes happens really fast. I see that a lot.
Yeah, that's really funny. One of our coaches, Doug Turner, likes to return the phrase, where there's a will, there's a way. He likes to turn it to where there's a way, there's a will, and just keep looking for ways, different pathways, what else. And so working with your client figured out one of the pathways towards community or towards being held is New Zealand. We have a community in a different geography. Let's plan towards that. You said that she worked on elegance and I understand what you're saying, as a yoga of idea. What did you say? Maximal results for minimal effort,
but maximum results, right? So we started to play in her, I mean, you might say like we worked with delegation, but the word that resonated with her in an embodied way, like it had a certain, because of her yoga teacher experience, right? And I'm not saying anyone should import this. This was totally native to her and what she had also cultivated during her life. So you may have something very different, but often when I work through the body with folks, we'll actually hone in on this word has there's a word in Indian raga singing, rasa. It has like a quality or a sensation to it that's resonant with me in some way, and I can bring myself back to that, almost like a marker, or you hear in like mindset work, anchoring. It's like in the body there's this sensation aspect that we can anchor, and then in any given moment, coming back to practical wisdom, there's a decision I need to make. Oh, can I make this decision from a place of elegance? How would I show up for her in this particular case that feels that way? And then we kind of unpack that and, well, what does that actually look like in practice? Well, it looks like only doing the things on my to-do list that I absolutely have to do and delegating the other things. We know these kinds of things, right? As coaches, we teach this, but
she's not that pressure cooker anymore. People aren't coming to her just for emergencies. You're saying she's actually changed.
So she's changed what she's doing behavior-wise, but she's kind of hung it on this way of being that has meaning to her. Because I could have said to her, well, look, honey, you need to delegate. And she would be like, no, I know, it's already on my to-do list to do that. And that's we know the things we need to do. You can read it in the book. It's going to say the same thing. But when it starts to get like more coherent, when you start to put all the pieces together in this way that's fully embodied, it's not just a to-do anymore. It's not.
Delegation.
We'll do that.
Yeah, it's on my to-do list. I'm getting to it. First of all, for people who are with us today, ask us any questions in the comments, any questions about women's leadership, about embodiment, about guts and grace, any of the terms that LeeAnn has brought up. Both either ask us questions, this is the right point for it, and also tell us what is a takeaway that you have so far, whether it's a thought you've had while you've been listening to LeeAnn or an action that you want to experiment with, something you want to try out.
Yes,
okay, LeeAnn, what is yours? What's your word that is like this Indian term? I think you said rasa, that embodies things for you.
Ooh, it's interesting. I mean, it changes, right? So over time, I would say I've walked this path for about 15 years. And it's funny you asked me this today. Last night, I decided to listen to a session that I'd had with a coach in 2006, so 14 years ago. And I heard myself say in a much younger, much less confident voice, there's this thing for me, and the word is trust. And what's interesting about that is I don't actually necessarily carry that exactly the same way today as like, that's my word. But everything that I teach in terms of guts and grace, and therefore everything that's my practice, or I've walked this path for 15 years, the work of guts and grace is my practice. My practice put in a book, taught in a program, basically offered to you, but really my own research through my own embodied experience, and also paired with a lot of 15 years of coaching folks and a lot of research and other things, but really like it's my path. So this word trust, it's like, I think at that time it was more like, can I trust other people? Do I trust that what I have to say will be heard? It was like that. Now it's much more like the deeper feeling sense of, as a human and as a woman in particular, can I trust that this body won't let me down? Can I trust that the things that I know or feel or believe are not, are not wrong, I could say, but just that like, there's been so much. I want you ask the question from the personal, so I don't want to avoid answering it from the personal. What comes up first, though, is there's been so much. We could use the word gaslighting, right? There's been so much. What is so for you isn't so for women throughout history. Women, minorities, other folks. I'm going to speak from the women's perspective here. So much what you know, what is so for you isn't so, that just that act. So in my client story, right, the moment of going, the longing for community doesn't have to mean X, or it doesn't have to be wrong, but just be with it for a minute. So this practice of trust, I think that's my word. I think it still in some ways is my word, right? It's like, what's the sensation of being in a meeting and hearing 6 people say different things, and knowing that something's getting missed, because in myself I can feel that something is off, or maybe it just feels like a gasp, for example, and then to go like, wait, no one else is going to say that. Do I trust myself enough to bring that forward, for example? That's a really silly kind of simple example, but not, right? I think it's very universal.
I'm really glad you drilled
trust.
down. I'm glad you drilled down to it, because at first, as you were talking about trust, I thought it was more about, do I, LeeAnn, trust my own instincts, beliefs, sensations? Now you're saying that, and also, do I trust them enough to kind of bank on them or rely on them or take an action based on the information that I know myself?
In the context, right, of maybe you pick your example, right? I work with a lot of women in the financial industry, like in the context of a boardroom where the only person who looks like me is me, or in the context of just the culture of a company where intuition isn't necessarily honored, and everybody wants to see the facts, and you don't have the facts, but you just know something is wrong. Or in the context of whatever is your example. In my case, it's often I often find myself being kind of like a canary in the coal mine in the different communities I'm a part of. It's like partly because of who I am and how I came into this world, and partly because of the practices that I'm in to refine embodied awareness.
Which a lot of people don't know. When you come to them with embodied awareness or embodied leadership, what does that even mean?
Well, what I was going to say is, in this case, it's like, because of all of that practice, I can sense when something is incoherent in what's happening. So when we're saying one thing, but something else is going on so quickly and so precisely often, that then it's like, oh God, am I going to be the person who says that?
So it seems to
be have people like me, can I have my own bag here, like that, for example? And so there's
it's almost like a level that rises in you. I'm noticing. Okay, I better speak up. I'm getting there. It's now. I have 3 concluding questions for you. One is, what are people most surprised by? So people who either go through your Guts and Grace program or who read the book, what are they most surprised by in these concepts?
Oh, that's a great question. That it works. Let me say more. I'll often give a talk. I tell the story of a woman who was on the path to executive leadership in the financial industry, And the homework practice that I gave her, very long story, very short, but the homework practice that I gave her was to walk more slowly from her office to her car once a day, every day. I may have told this story in the last time we talked. And it worked, meaning she was sort of not being taken seriously, but she was super driven. She moved really fast. She was showing up in a way that didn't have the kind of gravitas that they needed to see, although they couldn't voice that, right? They gave her tons of feedback on other things about not being strategic and, this and this and that. And ultimately it was just like they couldn't feel her gravity. And within like a week of walking more slowly, everybody was like, "Oh, you seem more connectable. Like we're getting what you have to say. Like we want to go with you." So people are surprised that some of these kinds of embodied practices can start to unravel or create a change or get a response in such a short time, and that they're I won't say they're easy. They're doable, right? If your entire life you've moved fast and leaned forward, then it's not actually easy to slow down and lean back. It's really, it's a mindfulness practice, but it's doable as well.
Yeah. That's really neat. And it's almost not quite that it's not believable, but it seems like a small change, a little bit like the elegant practice that you described by your client, but a small change that others can see. Not only that she felt a change, but others could see. Where I always love, especially in things like positive psychology, where you don't even need to tell people what you're trying, but you're experimenting. And then, oh, suddenly.
You don't know, right? So you'll do the practice, and like people didn't say, "Oh, I noticed you slowing down." People said, "You seem more connectable and available."
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to read it in the way that is what they've been looking for from you. But you know what you're doing, and we've kind of boiled it down to something very operationalizable.
Mm-hmm. 2 more questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
What is a thought that you want to leave our viewers with today?
Oh my gosh, trust your body. I suppose since I've just shared that my word is trust, let's have it be that. It's funny so the book Guts and Grace came out in January of this year, and then we went into COVID, and I don't even know if anyone's purchased it, but feel free if you want. But when I sign it, I'll write something. Usually what I write is, thank you for being and then I'll add a couple of adjectives that are what I believe is awesome about the person who is purchasing the book, or I'll ask them, what are your strengths? And then I'll write, usually always remember to trust your gut. So if you do get a copy, write that on it for me on my like, that if you listen, the pathway will show itself in some way. And it may not be easy. It may not be like it takes a while. Sometimes it's a mess, but it works.
I am right now dropping in the link to your book and the link to your website so people have it as they're watching this. And my last question to you, if you could just snap your fingers and everybody or almost everybody were to do one action, what would you want that action to be?
Oh, one action. I mean, in some ways, I want to say the same thing, but let me see if I can be more creative than that. I guess it's kind of the opposite of that, or the counter to that, right? Like I want everyone who, whether you identify as a woman or a man, however you identify, to if you hear a different perspective that doesn't quite totally make sense, to get curious and create space for it, because I guess I believe and I see that we have built a world on certain paradigms that I don't think are really working anymore. I don't know if that's too big of a statement for this conversation, but and so the only way we're going to have something different, I kind of use this sort of feminine masculine, like something rebalancing, but even if that's not your thing, the only way that we're going to get better, the only way that we're going to build the next thing that's beyond where we are, is if we don't always think we're right, that we allow space for the other perspectives. If it's like, we do everything with the mind, like let's invite the body, or we do everything with the masculine, let's invite the feminine, to be in the practice right now when I snap my fingers, of getting curious rather than pushing back on, creating space for rather than, creating resistance to the other side of the conversation. And I think that's a good place to end, because we were looking for, when I wrote Guts and Grace, what kind of an image to put on the cover, and we ended up with something I'll show you that looks kind of like none of that. But we decided that really the ampersand, the and, was the brand. And right, both parts, both sides of the equation, both aspects of yourself, if you can make space for not just the one that's practiced or that you know works or that you're sold on already, but the and of the other potential side of the coin, I think that opens a lot of possibility for innovation and for what's next.
Wherever you are, explore the other way of what you are, whether it's how you perceive the world or how you take on habits or how you interact with people, but be curious about the other.
Make space for it if someone else is bringing it your way, because there's probably a reason that it's good medicine for you or your company or whatever you're up to.
Be open to the good medicine around you. LeeAnn, Mallorie, thank you so very much. Thank you. We've dropped LeeAnn's links into the chat, so feel free to reach out to her on LinkedIn to check out her book, her website. We're delighted that you've been with us. Thank you so much, LeeAnn.
Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you. All the best. See you again. We're here Monday to Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific.